So if you find a house, you might find things all left behind on a particular floor. And you might want to expose that whole building, that whole floor, what's outside. Maybe there's other buildings on that same floor, that same surface. And that's a horizontal exposure, that you're trying to find a single point in time and what was happening at that point of time. And does that mean that there's nothing below it? Of course not. There may be vertical information, chronological information, but a series of horizontal exposures. So these series of horizontal exposures are what we call strata, and stratification is the layering of these things. So layers deposited over time accumulate through a variety of different measures. They can be cultural, so people just bringing stuff in, or a house collapsing and building up through time, and then you build on top of that. It can be water coming in and bringing deposits, or windblown deposits coming in, and you create this accumulation of soil that stacks through time like a layer cake. And the law of superposition is really crucial to understanding the way archaeology is done, excavation especially. In an undisturbed depositional sequence, each layer is younger than the layer beneath it. Now think of a layer cake, right? If you're making a layer cake, you want to have the bottom layer here, and then you put some cream there, put another layer, and then some more cream, and then another layer, and some cream. The first layer's got to go on first, right? You can't put the first layer on last. It doesn't work that way. So as things build up through time, it's representing the passage of time. And so when you cut your cake, if you cut a slice of cake out, in this cross section that you've just cut, you can actually see this layer of cake, this layer of cake, this layer of cake, this layer of cake, and that represents the earliest one is the bottom one, and the latest one is the top layer. Okay, that's the law of superposition. And so these accumulation of strata can be natural processes, water or windborne deposits, geological, but they can also be anthropogenic. They can be laid down by humans and their behavior. And the stratigraphic analysis shows these separate depositional layers. Now, here's the crucial thing, because this is going to relate to another point. We're now on excavation, but in each of these layers, you're going to find stuff, right? So it's not just that here's a layer of cake, and here's a layer of cake, and here's a layer of cake. In that layer, you're going to have artifacts and ecofacts. And in each stratum, each horizontal layer, those are going to be an assemblage, a complete set of things that people used at that time. And that's going to change through time. The next stratum is going to have different sets of artifacts and ecofacts. And the next layer is going to have different sets of artifacts and ecofacts, and so on and so forth. That way we can not only see what happens in each slice of time, but we can see how things change through time based on our analysis of the stuff that comes from them. So we need to create this sequence of layers, of strata. More essentially, what they are contexts for the humans that lived at those time periods. Those contexts include everything that they lived in. So that really awkward question I asked you before, how would you describe your culture, your society? How would you describe yourself and the world you lived in? It's not easy to do even right now for you and me in our own situation where we can see everything. But for archaeologists, it means we've got a slice of time where we can look at all the stuff, build up a picture, and then that mosaic starts to come together. But that mosaic is going to change through time. The next mosaic that we draw for the next stratum up is going to have different elements. It's going to have different organization. It's going to have different pieces to that puzzle. So I'll say a few more things about excavation before I get to another section on artifacts and ecofacts. So let me just finish up on excavation. There's a diagram in your book that shows how we pick apart different stratigraphic details and where things come from. It's figure 1.8, and it shows a profile, a cross-section. Let's say you've excavated through a series of, in a sort of a squared off trench, and what you've dug is in that trench, but outside of it you haven't excavated. So that cross-section is still there. Like your cake, you've cut a slice out, but the rest of the cake is all still there. So you can actually see those layers of cake, or those strata of archaeology, in the sides of your trench. So essentially, and you can draw that, you can illustrate that, you can photograph that, you can record that. So that's what figure 1.8 shows. And just to illustrate how we make associations between different contexts, this actually, I want to just ask you a question. There's a burial here. What stratum does that buried human remains belong to? 1 or 2? Now, if you look at it, the human is actually sitting on a surface that is in stratum 2, right? But where was the pit, the tomb, the grave that the person is resting in? When does that date to? That was dug down from the stratum above. So the people who dug the grave were actually standing on the surface relating to building 1 on stratum 1, right? And they dug down into the earlier deposits. So even though it looks like that body is in stratum 2, it's actually digging down and intrusive into it. So it doesn't date to that time period. So all of those walls, all of those artifacts, all that context in stratum 2, the lower stratum, is not related to the burial and the building above it. Those are later, right? Does that make sense? So if you have problems with that, we can talk about it. So it's very important to control your excavations because you're trying to record this all along. So this is really essential. We use a grid system often, and you leave, if you're digging just a box in the middle of nowhere, then you don't have to worry about your cross sections that you've left behind. But if you're digging multiple squares, what you want to do is leave a bulk in between so you can draw those sections that we saw in the last slide. This controls your horizontal and vertical spaces, and it's also tied to a data point, a datum point, a location that can put you on a map. And this is both horizontal and vertical. So a two-dimensional drawing, you can put levels and elevations on that will give you a point of reference for both horizontal space, so you can draw a map of it, but also for vertical, so you can tell where you are in terms of depth and relationships to one another, which then can tell you more about the chronology, right? So what stratum, what layer are we talking about? And this is used to establish provenience, the context of objects that we can then draw conclusions about. We can say here is an assemblage. These are all the objects that people were using at this time. Figure 1.9 shows how this is done. So you create a datum point, which is both horizontal, so you can find in a gridded space where you are, but also vertically, you can measure to that datum point that shows you how much farther down you are, which demonstrates stratigraphy, depth of deposit, and ultimately infers chronology. So as you do this, as I mentioned before, you're screening everything to find small artifacts. You wet sieve things to find even finer pieces and organic remains through flotation. And the recording methods that you use are absolutely essential because you're destroying things as you take them apart. And then you take those, all of that information, and it allows you to reconstruct the context of the entire archaeological context of people's behavior in the past. Okay, so I'll pause for here, and we'll do the final section of this chapter in next lecture, which will be on artifacts and ecofacts and our bringing it all together. Okay, see you then.